let's look at arrays. You remember that we previously explained how a variable works. So at first, you define the type of the variable. Let's say we are defining a variable that is of integer data type, and we name the variable, and then we give the value to the variable. So let's say we're defining our integer x to have a value 10 stored in it. So what happens here is that in your memory, a small chunk of the memory is reserved for x, and the value 10 is stored there. Arrays are the same. However, as you've seen that x in this case was only able to store one value, which was 10. An array can store many different values at the same time. So instead of storing just 10, we can store, let's say, 0, 1, 3, 5, 7, 12, 14,000, whatever we need. We can store it in one array, and one array can store all of this together at the same time. So how many different numbers have we put do we want to put in our array in this example? That will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this array would be 7 elements long. What would happen is that in your memory, in your RAM, one big piece of the memory would be taken and would be divided up into 7 different parts. So here 0 would be stored, 1 would be stored, 3 would be stored, 5, 7, 12, and then 14,000. So this is how an array would be stored in your memory, and this would be the small chunk of that memory that would be assigned for the array. Now this memory is contiguous, which means that there are no gaps between the memory addresses of one element from the previous one. So the memory location where 0 would be stored, the very next memory location 1 would be stored. The very next memory location 3 would be stored. Of course, these memory locations can be larger or smaller based on how large the number itself is, but ultimately wherever 0 would end, 1 would start, and that is what we mean by contiguous. So this is how an array is stored in memory. How do we define an array in Java? Now, arrays can be, just like variables can be of different data types. You can have integer type variables, you can have character type variables, you can have Boolean type variables, or you can have float type variables, and all those different types of variables. Arrays can also be of different types. So if you define an array to be of integer type, then the only values that it can store would be integers. If you define an array to be a double type, then it can only store double type of variables or double type of values. So let's define an integer type array, and let's say we want to name our array as my array. So this would be the name of our array, and the definition of its data type would be here. These square brackets denote that we are defining an array. So in order to define our array, what we would need to do is at first say new, and that would be the that is a keyword that would allow us to create a new array. And then we would say int, and inside the square brackets we would say how long do we want our array to be, how many elements do we want our array to be able to store. So right now we have 7 different elements that we want to store in our array. So we would say 7. What this would do is that this would create an empty array. This would not create an array with these elements here. This would just create an empty array with 7 different memory locations that would allow us to store 7 different elements. Of course, these memory locations are contiguous, as we've discussed before. So this would create an empty array. And in this array, we can then assign our numbers. So we can say my array, and in square brackets, 0 equals 0. So this is actually called an index. The indices of an array allow us to access the different elements in the array. And what an index means is the position of an element in the array. The position of the first element always is 0. The second element is 1, the third element is 2, then it is 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so on. Now, because we have 7 elements, our index would start from 0, and it would end at 6. So when we say my array, and in square brackets, we say 0, at that point, this memory location is accessed. So right now we're saying that in my array, in the very first memory location, which is 0, put that value to be 0. So the value would be assigned here. Then we can say my array 1 equals 1. At that point, the first location would have the value 1. And then we'll say my array 2, and this is the third location. And so at that point, we want to store 3. We can then say my array 6th location, which is this one. We can say this is the 7th location. The index is 6. We can say 14,000, and so 14,000 would be stored here. And in this way, we can populate our array. But what if we want to define our array with these elements in the array in the very beginning, so that we don't have to define, or we don't have to assign the values later on after we define our empty array? How can we define an array that is not empty in the very beginning? What we can do is we can say, again, this would be an integer type array, and so we can say my array equals new int, and then in the square brackets we would not put anything. Instead, we would have the third brackets that will open up, second brackets that will open up, and we can then just assign the values right there. And this would create an array that already has all these values in the array to begin with. And that is how we define an array, with elements that are already in there. How do we access this element, let's say 5? This element is index 0, 1, 2, 3. This is index 3. So if we say system.out.println my array 0, 1, 2, 3, my array 3, this would actually print out 5 in our console. So this is how you define an array. This is how you put values or elements in the array, and this is how you can retrieve or get back the values that are in the array.